They weren't monsters from a fantasy novel. They weren't characters invented to frighten children around a fire at night. They were spoken of in synagogues, whispered in marketplaces, debated by scribes who copied the sacred scrolls by lamplight, and feared by common people who had never once left the village where they were born. And yet, no one had ever seen one. What were the Nephilim? Where did they come from? Why did stories about them spread so powerfully across first-century Judea, a land already saturated with Roman occupation, crushing taxes, drought, and the weight of a people waiting for deliverance? And why, more importantly, did Jesus never once use the word? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels and how we understand the world Jesus chose to enter. To understand why myths about the Nephilim took hold in the time of Jesus, you have to first understand what it felt like to live in that world. Not the theological world, the physical one. Picture the village of Capernaum on a morning in early spring. The air smells of fish oil and damp stone. The streets, if you can call them that, are narrow dirt paths worn smooth by sandaled feet and donkey hooves. The houses are low, built from dark basalt blocks, their roofs made of compacted mud and straw laid over wooden beams. Inside, a family of 6 sleeps, eats, argues, prays, and dies in a space no larger than a modern living room. There is no separation between the sleeping area and the area where animals are kept at night for warmth. The floor is packed earth. Light comes from a small clay oil lamp that flickers in the draught from the door. This is not poverty by accident. This is the ordinary life of the overwhelming majority of people in first-century Galilee. If you find value in recovering this kind of forgotten world, the real world Jesus walked through, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next in this series. Now, in this world, knowledge traveled slowly, unevenly, and always through human mouths. There were no printed books. The Torah and the prophets existed in scrolls kept in the synagogue, handled only by those with the training and status to read them aloud. Most people, perhaps 90% of the population, could not read. What they knew about their sacred history came from what they heard, from the Hazan who read on the Sabbath, from the elder who interpreted, from the traveler who arrived dusty from Jerusalem with stories about what the scribes were saying, from the grandmother who had memorized entire passages from childhood and recited them while grinding grain at dawn. In this world of oral transmission, stories did not merely inform. They shaped the imagination. They became the lens through which people interpreted everything they saw around them. Ruins on a hilltop, bones dug up from the earth, the inexplicable size of the ancient stone walls at Hebron, the collapsed cities of the valley that seemed too large to have been built by ordinary hands. And the Nephilim were already in the text. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. 4 verses, terse, strange, almost deliberately obscure. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. That was it. 4 verses. And from those 4 verses, an entire mythological world had grown. By the time of Jesus, the literature surrounding those 4 verses had expanded enormously. The Book of Enoch, a text not included in the Hebrew canon but deeply influential, especially in certain communities, told an elaborate story. 200 angels, called Watchers, descended from heaven onto a mountain called Hermon. They took human wives. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge, how to make weapons, how to use enchantments, how to cut roots for potions. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were giants of enormous size and appetite who devoured the resources of the earth, then turned on the people themselves. The earth cried out. Heaven responded. Judgment came. This was not fringe literature. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved by the community at Qumran, one of the most scripturally rigorous Jewish communities of the era. The letter of Jude, in the New Testament itself, references Enoch directly. The imagery of angels in chains, imprisoned in darkness, waiting for judgment, which appears in both Jude and 2 Peter, draws unmistakably from this tradition. The stories about the Nephilim were not marginal. They were part of the living theological air that people breathed. But here is what matters for understanding why those stories spread so powerfully in precisely the 1st century, in precisely that land, at precisely that moment of history. The people of Judea and Galilee were living in a world of colossal, unexplained things. When they walked to Jerusalem for the Passover pilgrimage, a journey that took days on foot, they approached the Temple Mount and looked up at walls built from stones so massive that even today, engineers study them with a kind of reverence. The largest stones in the Western Wall weigh over 500 tons. 500 tons. Moved, lifted, set in place without cranes, without steel, without combustion engines. By human hands. How? How had that been done? The answer that the surrounding culture, and even some Jewish traditions, reached for was not engineering. It was not patient labor measured over generations. It was the Nephilim. It was the giants. It was the remnants of a race of beings who had once walked the earth with a scale and power that ordinary human bodies could not replicate. When the spies sent by Moses returned from Canaan and said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them," that text, that image, lived in people's minds as something close to literal memory. The giants had been there. Their descendants might still be there, somewhere, in the ruins, in the wilderness, in the bones buried beneath the valleys. This was the mythological background of the world Jesus entered, not as a theological debate among scholars, as a living, breathing, emotionally powerful narrative that shaped how ordinary people understood history, evil, corruption, and the fallen state of the world. There is something important to understand about the way myths function in a society under pressure. They do not appear randomly. They do not survive simply because they are entertaining. Myths survive and spread because they are doing work. They are explaining something that official explanations have failed to address. They are giving a name to a fear that has no other name. They are providing a framework for suffering that would otherwise feel meaningless and arbitrary. 1st century Judea was a society under extraordinary pressure. The Romans had occupied the land since 63 BC, when Pompey marched into Jerusalem and entered the Holy of Holies. A desecration so profound that it echoed through Jewish consciousness for generations. By the time of Jesus, Roman rule had settled into the particular cruelty of normalized domination. There were soldiers on the roads. There were toll collectors at the gates. Men like Matthew sitting at their tables, extracting money from fishermen and farmers who had already paid temple taxes and tithed to the priests and struggled to survive drought and poor harvests. The taxation system was layered, relentless, and deeply humiliating. And above the Roman administration loomed the temple establishment, the chief priests, the scribes, the aristocratic Sadducean families who had negotiated a careful, profitable arrangement with the occupying power. These were men of enormous wealth and political influence in a land where most people had neither. Their houses in the upper city of Jerusalem, excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century, contained mosaic floors, elaborate ritual baths, imported pottery from across the Mediterranean, and rooms of a size and elegance that would have been incomprehensible to a fishing family in Capernaum. The distance between those two worlds, the basalt house with the dirt floor and the Jerusalem mansion with the mosaic courtyard, was not merely economic. It was cosmic in the perception of the people who lived it. It felt like the distance between different orders of being. And this is precisely where the mythology of the Nephilim became emotionally and theologically useful. The tradition inherited from the Book of Enoch and related literature did not present the Nephilim simply as large people. It presented them as the origin of a particular kind of corruption. A corruption that was not human in its source, but that had infected the human world from outside, from above, from a rebellion within the divine order itself. The Watchers had brought forbidden knowledge. They had introduced violence, vanity, the lust for power, the hoarding of resources. Their giant offspring had consumed what belonged to others. The earth had become a place of injustice, not because humans had simply made bad choices, but because something had broken at a fundamental level, and the effects of that breaking were still reverberating through history. For a peasant farmer in Galilee, watching Roman soldiers march past his field, watching the tax collector measure his grain, watching his daughter go hungry so that the household could meet its obligations, this framework was not abstract comfort. It was a map. It named what he was experiencing. The injustice around him was not natural. It was not the way things were supposed to be. It was the long shadow of a primordial corruption, a wound in the order of creation that had never fully healed. The Nephilim stories gave evil a genealogy. Walk through the market of any Galilean town in the 1st century, and you will feel the texture of this anxiety in the objects around you. The amulets worn around necks, small cylinders of rolled metal inscribed with protective texts, or clay figures meant to ward off the evil eye. The mezuzot on doorposts, yes, but also the additional protective symbols scratched into lintels by hands that knew the official religion and also knew that the official religion did not always feel sufficient against the specific terrors of the night. The folk healers who knew which roots to boil for fever and which words to say over a child who woke screaming from a dream. The divination practices that the Torah explicitly forbade and that people practiced anyway, quietly, because the world felt porous and dangerous and inhabited by forces that the synagogue sermon did not fully account for. This was a world that believed deeply in the reality of spiritual forces, not as metaphor, not as psychological language, but as literal inhabitants of the same physical space that human beings occupied. Demons caused illness. Unclean spirits inhabited people and drove them toward destruction. The wilderness, that dry, stony, wind-scoured space beyond the villages, was not merely empty geography. It was the dwelling place of powers that had no interest in human flourishing. And the Nephilim, in this tradition, were connected to all of it. The Book of Enoch taught that when the giant offspring of the Watchers were killed in the flood, when their enormous bodies died, their spirits did not go where human spirits go. They became the demons that wander the earth, homeless, disembodied, hungry. They sought entry into human lives, into human bodies, into the cracks of the world where suffering had created openings. This is the demonological world that Jesus walked into when he began his ministry. The Gospels record, with a matter-of-fact consistency that is easy to read past, that Jesus encountered people described as possessed by unclean spirits, by demons, by legion, a name that carried its own political weight, since a Roman legion was precisely the organized, occupying force of violence that structured daily life in the land. When Jesus cast out demons in the synagogue at Capernaum, the people's response was not theological analysis. It was visceral recognition. What is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. They were not surprised that unclean spirits existed. They were surprised that someone had authority over them. This is the world the Nephilim mythology was helping to explain, and the world it was simultaneously helping to sustain, because myths that name evil also, in a way, confirm its power. To say the demons come from the spirits of the Nephilim is to say, evil has deep roots, ancient roots, roots that go all the way back to a rebellion before the flood. It cannot be easily undone. It requires something more than human effort, more than Torah observance, more than priestly ritual. It requires a power from outside the ordinary order. The expectation that was building in first-century Judaism across its many competing factions, from the Pharisees to the Essenes, to the Zealots, to the common people who belonged to none of these groups but carried their own fierce, personal hope, was the expectation of exactly that kind of power arriving, something that could finally address the root of what was wrong. Not a better Roman emperor, not a more honest high priest, something that could reach back to the origin of the corruption and undo it. The myths about the Nephilim were, in their own way, a form of longing, a description of the wound that made the people ready for a healer. There is a village in the hills of Lower Galilee called Nazareth. In the 1st century, it was not a place of any particular importance. No major road passed through it. No famous rabbi had been born there. No significant event in Israel's long history had taken place on its hillside. It was small, perhaps 200 to 400 people at most, and it sat in a bowl of limestone hills above the Jezreel Valley, looking out over one of the most historically saturated landscapes in the ancient world. From the high ground above Nazareth, on a clear day, you could see Megiddo. You could see the valley where the armies of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon had marched. You could see, if you knew how to read the landscape, the accumulated weight of centuries of conquest, displacement, and survival. The people who grew up in Nazareth did not need a scroll to understand that they lived in a land that had been fought over, occupied, and bled across more times than anyone could count. Jesus grew up looking at that valley. He grew up in a household where Joseph worked as a tekton, a word usually translated as carpenter, but more accurately meaning a craftsman who worked with hard materials, stone as much as wood, the kind of man who was hired to build and repair the structures that village life depended on. This was not a wealthy occupation, but it was a skilled one. It placed the family somewhere in the precarious middle of village social structure, not destitute, not comfortable, always aware of how quickly circumstances could shift. In that household, the sacred texts were not abstract. They were recited, memorized, chewed over in the way that people who have no other access to a text chew it over, slowly, repeatedly, from childhood, until the words become part of the interior landscape of the mind. The stories of Genesis were not ancient history in the way we might experience ancient history, as something safely distant, studied through glass in a museum. They were living memory. The flood was a story about what happened when the world became so corrupt that creation itself had to be interrupted and restarted. The Nephilim were part of that story. The corruption of the Watchers was part of that story. The violence and the giants and the crying out of the earth, all of it lived in the imagination of a boy growing up in Nazareth as vividly as the Roman soldiers he saw on the road below. And yet, when Jesus began to teach, he did not reach for that mythology. This is one of the most striking silences in the Gospels, and it is almost never discussed. Jesus taught in a world saturated with Enochic tradition. He taught to people who believed in the Nephilim, who feared the demons that the tradition said were their spirits, who understood the brokenness of the world through the framework of that primordial corruption. His disciples had grown up with these stories. The crowds who followed him carried these frameworks in their minds. The scribes and Pharisees who debated with him were intimately familiar with the full range of Second Temple literature, including the traditions that elaborated on Genesis 6. And Jesus, almost entirely, said nothing about it. He spoke of demons, yes, he cast them out. He acknowledged the reality of spiritual opposition in terms that his listeners understood as literal and immediate. But he did not build his teaching on the mythology of the Watchers and the Nephilim. He did not explain suffering and evil by pointing to the rebellion of angelic beings in the time before the flood. He did not invite his followers into an elaborate cosmological narrative about the origin of the world's corruption. Instead, he told stories about farmers, about a man who had 2 sons and divided his inheritance between them, about a woman who lost a coin and swept her whole house searching for it, about a shepherd who left 99 sheep to find the one that was missing, about seeds falling on different kinds of ground, some on the path where birds ate them, some on rocky soil where they sprouted fast and died faster, some among thorns, some on good earth where they produced 30, 60, 100-fold. These were not the stories of a teacher who thought the primary problem with the world was cosmic, angelic rebellion, the contamination of the human bloodline by supernatural beings, the spread of demonic spirits across the earth as the legacy of antediluvian giants. These were the stories of a teacher who thought the primary problem with the world was immediate, human, and located in the interior landscape of the heart. Consider the parable of the sower, told on the shore of the Sea of Galilee to a crowd that had pressed so close that Jesus had to get into a boat and push out a little from the land just to have enough space to speak. The crowd standing on that shore knew exactly what he was talking about. They were farmers, most of them, or the children of farmers. They knew the rocky ground, the thin skin of soil over limestone bedrock where nothing could root deeply. They knew the path ground, compacted by feet and hooves until it was almost as hard as stone. They knew the thorns, the dense, scrubby growth that would reclaim a field with terrifying speed if you stopped working it for a single season. They also knew the heartbreak of a bad harvest. In a subsistence economy, a bad harvest was not a financial setback. It was the beginning of a cascade. Debt, the selling of land, the loss of the family holding that had been passed down through generations, the descent into the status of a day laborer with no land and no security and no future to pass to your children. The difference between seed that fell on good ground and seed that fell on rocky ground was not metaphorical to these people. It was the difference between eating and not eating, between dignity and shame. When Jesus said that the seed on rocky ground represented the person who received the word with joy but had no root, who believed for a while but fell away in a time of testing, he was drawing on an image that his listeners felt in their bodies. They had watched good grain die on rocky ground. They understood rootlessness as a form of vulnerability so profound it bordered on tragedy. This is the method of Jesus as a teacher. Not mythological elaboration, not cosmological speculation, radical concreteness. He took the stuff of daily survival, seeds and soil, bread and salt, sheep and coins and oil lamps and wineskins, and he used it to speak about the nature of the kingdom of God and the condition of the human heart. And in doing so, he was implicitly offering a different answer to the same question the Nephilim mythology was trying to answer. The mythology said, the world is broken because something went wrong outside of human agency, at a level above and before human history. Angelic rebellion, supernatural contamination, the long shadow of giants. Jesus said, the world is broken because of what happens in the human heart when it is hardened, when it is shallow, when it is choked by the competing urgencies of wealth and worry and the desire for comfort. And the world can be healed, not by a cosmic military victory over angelic rebels, but by the patient, quiet, irresistible growth of something small and living planted in receptive ground. The kingdom of God, he said, is like a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds, planted in ground, growing without drama, without spectacle, without the thunder and fire that apocalyptic expectation had trained people to look for. Growing the way things always grow in a world where farmers rise before dawn and go to bed exhausted and trust the process of seed and soil and rain and sun, a trust that is not passive, but is also not in control of the outcome. This was not the answer people were expecting. It was not the answer the Nephilim mythology had prepared them for. It was something quieter, more demanding, and infinitely more intimate. There is a moment in the Gospel of Matthew that most readers pass through quickly because it seems like a simple answer to a simple question. The disciples come to Jesus privately on the Mount of Olives, looking out over Jerusalem with its massive temple walls catching the last light of the afternoon. They ask him, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" It is exactly the kind of question that the Nephilim mythology had been training people to ask. The apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple period, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the War Scroll from Qumran, had built an elaborate architecture of expectation around this question. There would be signs, there would be cosmic upheaval, there would be a final reckoning with the forces of corruption that had entered the world through the Watchers, through the giants, through the long chain of contamination that had flowed from that primordial rebellion into the present moment of history. The end would look like the beginning, but reversed. What had been broken would be restored. What had been unleashed would be bound. Jesus answered the question, but not in the way the architecture of expectation had prepared them for. He spoke of wars and rumors of wars, of famines and earthquakes, of persecution and betrayal, of false prophets who would come performing great signs and wonders, and here the language is precise and deliberate, so convincing that they would deceive, if possible, even the elect. He spoke of the abomination of desolation. He spoke of a tribulation unlike anything that had come before. And then, in the middle of this discourse, he reached for a comparison that is extraordinary in its specificity. As it was in the days of Noah, he said, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. The days of Noah, the precise moment in Genesis that the Nephilim mythology was built around. The moment before the flood, when the sons of God had taken human wives, when the Nephilim walked the earth, when the corruption had reached its fullest expression and the judgment of heaven had finally responded. Every person listening to Jesus on that hillside would have felt the weight of that reference. They knew those days. They had grown up with the stories of those days. The Book of Enoch had painted those days in vivid, terrifying detail. The giants consuming the earth, the forbidden knowledge spreading, the violence multiplying until creation itself could not sustain the weight of it. And Jesus looked at his disciples and said, "It will be like that again." But then, and this is the moment that changes everything, he continued, "For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. Eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. Not the orgies of fallen angels, not the cannibalistic feasts of giants, not the spread of forbidden knowledge and the proliferation of weapons and the corruption of the bloodline of humanity. Eating and drinking, the most ordinary, daily, bodily acts of human life. Marrying, the most fundamental social institution of that world, the architecture around which family, property, inheritance, and identity were organized. The people of Noah's generation were not destroyed because they were spectacularly evil in some mythologically dramatic way. They were taken by surprise because they were absorbed in the ordinary rhythms of daily life, in the continuous present tense of eating and planning and marrying and building, while the most important thing that had ever happened was unfolding right beside them, and they had no attention left to perceive it. This is the pivot. This is the moment where Jesus takes the mythology his listeners brought to that hillside and quietly, completely reframes it. The danger is not the Nephilim. The danger is not the return of giants, the spreading of demonic contamination, the fulfillment of some elaborate cosmological timetable laid out in the apocalyptic scrolls. The danger is ordinary human inattention. The danger is the capacity of daily life, its legitimate hungers, its necessary routines, its real and pressing demands, to fill the entire field of consciousness so completely that there is no space left for the recognition of what is actually happening in the world. The people of Noah's day knew nothing about what would happen, not because the information was hidden from them. Noah had been building an enormous wooden structure in their midst for decades. The warning was visible. It was undeniable. It was physically present in the landscape of their daily lives. They simply could not afford, or chose not, to take it seriously, because taking it seriously would have required them to reorganize everything, to stop eating and drinking in the same way, to stop marrying and giving in marriage according to the same calculations, to stop and look at what was being built in their midst and ask what it meant. They knew nothing, because they chose, continuously, in the small decisions of each ordinary day, not to know. Sit with that for a moment, because it reaches across 2,000 years with remarkable precision. The world that Jesus was addressing was full of elaborate explanations for why things had gone wrong. The Nephilim mythology was one of the most comprehensive, a story that traced the corruption of the world all the way back to a supernatural event before human history, that gave evil a genealogy more ancient than any human choice, that located the source of suffering outside the human heart and in the rebellion of cosmic powers. It was, in a certain sense, a story that absolved ordinary people of the deepest responsibility. The world was broken because angels fell. The world was broken because giants walked. The world was broken because something happened before you were born, at a level you had no access to, in a drama you were not part of. Jesus did not deny that the spiritual world was real. He did not deny that powers and forces existed beyond the visible and the human. He cast out demons with a word. He acknowledged that the adversary was real and active. He used the days of Noah as a reference point for the gravity of what was coming. But he refused to allow the mythology to become an excuse. He refused to allow the elaborate cosmological narrative, however true its elements might be, to distract from the immediate, interior, daily work of attention and faithfulness that he was calling his followers to. Because the people eating and drinking and marrying in Noah's day were not destroyed by the Nephilim. They were not destroyed by giants or demons or the spirits of the antediluvian dead. They were destroyed by their own inattention to the word that had been placed in their midst. The ark was there. The warning was there. And they chose, day after day, the comfort of the familiar over the disruption of the true. This is what Jesus saw when he looked at the crowds that followed him. Not monsters, not the corrupted offspring of fallen angels. People, ordinary, hungry, tired, hopeful, frightened people, eating their bread and planning their marriages and paying their taxes and trying to survive, who were in danger not of some spectacular supernatural catastrophe, but of missing entirely the most significant moment in the history of the world, because they were too absorbed in the continuous present tense of daily life to look up. The Nephilim stories spread in his time because people needed an explanation for the scale of the wrongness they felt around them. The giants explained the impossible stones. The fallen angels explained the origin of violence and forbidden knowledge. The demonic spirits explained the suffering that medicine could not reach, and prayer did not always resolve. These stories were doing real work in real people's lives, and Jesus understood that. He did not mock them. He did not systematically refute them. He walked through a world that believed them, and he addressed the deeper need they were trying to meet. But he offered something different. Not a better mythology, not a more detailed cosmological map. He offered a way of seeing the present moment with clarity, seeing the seed in the soil, the coin in the dust, the sun on the road home, the kingdom growing quietly in the midst of a world that was mostly looking somewhere else for it. The myths about the Nephilim spread with no evidence and no explanation because the human heart, under pressure, reaches for stories large enough to match the scale of its suffering. Jesus understood that reach. He honored it. And then he pointed gently and persistently toward something closer. Closer than cosmic history, closer than angelic genealogy, closer than the bones of giants buried under the valleys of Canaan. He pointed toward the ground beneath your feet, the seed in your hand, the door you could choose today, to open or to close. That was where the kingdom was. That was where it had always been.